Legends like Judy Garland and Errol Flynn died nearly penniless, their mansions replaced by rented rooms. Did you know that one Disney child star was found dead in an abandoned building and buried in an unmarked grave? The truth will shock you. Number 15. Judy Garland. Judy Garland, the sparkling ruby-slippered girl who captured hearts as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, amassed an astounding $40 million during her career, a fortune that vanished like a Kansas tornado. By the time she died in 1969 at just 47, the woman who taught us to dream somewhere over the rainbow had a measly $40,000 to her name and crushing debts of $4 million. How does someone lose everything like that? Studio executives at MGM worked her to exhaustion, feeding the teenage Garland a toxic cocktail of amphetamines to keep her thin and barbiturates to help her sleep. This Hollywood-sanctioned addiction spiraled out of control, draining her finances through mounting medical bills and desperate attempts at rehabilitation. Her third husband, Sid Luft, allegedly burned through much of her remaining fortune on failed business ventures and personal indulgences. In her final years, Garland's life became a haunting shadow of her former glory. The woman who once commanded sold-out concerts at Carnegie Hall was reduced to performing in seedy London nightclubs for pocket change. Sometimes, she'd skip out on hotel bills she couldn't afford to pay. Her vocal cords, once insured for millions, were now merely tools for survival as she desperately tried to earn enough to support her children. When she was found dead from an accidental overdose, the papers called it the day the rainbow died. The shocking contrast between her $40 million career earnings and $40,000 estate represents one of Hollywood's most devastating falls from grace, a cautionary tale of an industry that used her up and tossed her aside. What other forgotten star fell even harder than Judy? Keep watching to find out. Number 14. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn, Hollywood's original bad boy and swashbuckling heartthrob, went from commanding millions to dying. With a pathetic $10,000 in 1959, the dashing star of Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood lived as recklessly with money as he did with everything else in his life. His motto? I like my whiskey old and my women young. A philosophy that eventually destroyed both his reputation and his bank account. At his peak in the 1930 and 40 seconds, Flynn was among Warner Brothers' highest-paid stars, with a salary that would translate to millions today. But his addiction to the high life drained his fortune at breakneck speed. Flynn dropped astronomical sums on yachts, including his famous vessel Roscoe, lavish properties across the globe, and wild, days-long parties that became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Money slipped through his fingers faster than he could make it. His spectacular downfall accelerated after a highly publicized 1943 statutory rape trial. Though acquitted, the scandal permanently tarnished his golden boy image and cost him a fortune in legal fees. The tabloids dubbed him "in like Flynn," a crude reference that would haunt him for years. A bitter divorce from actress Lily Demita further bled his finances dry when she received a massive settlement. Flynn's desperation became painfully apparent in his final years. Alcoholism and liver disease ravaged his once legendary good looks, and he was forced to take roles in B-movies just to keep afloat. His final project, a film called William Tell, collapsed when funding disappeared, leaving him buried in debt. The man who had once been the definition of Hollywood glamour died, broke and broken, his body ravaged by years of excess at just 50 years old. Have you ever wondered which golden age beauty went from magazine covers to prostitution on Sunset Boulevard? The answer will break your heart. Number 13. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton's stunning fall from Hollywood starlet to streetwalker remains one of Tinseltown's most tragic descents. The blonde bombshell who once shared the screen with James Cagney in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, 1950, ended her life, turning tricks on the same boulevards where her name had once graced theater marquees. From studio contracts to sleeping in alleys? How does that even happen? Payton burst onto the scene with her dazzling beauty and undeniable screen presence, quickly catching the attention of major studios and influential men. Critics praised her raw talent, with Variety calling her a newcomer of considerable promise. But behind the glamour, Payton's self-destructive tendencies were already taking root. Her spectacular downfall began with a scandalous love triangle involving actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal. The situation exploded when Neal brutally beat Tone, landing him in the hospital with a broken nose, cheekbone, and brain concussion. The ensuing tabloid frenzy destroyed Payton's carefully crafted image. Hollywood's moral guardians quickly blacklisted the troublesome actress, and quality roles evaporated overnight. As her career imploded, Payton spiraled into alcoholism and drug addiction. Police regularly detained her for public drunkenness, passing bad checks, and eventually prostitution. By her late 30s, the woman who once commanded $10,000 per film was charging $5 for sex on Sunset Boulevard, her once famous face now bloated and unrecognizable. On May 8, 1967, Payton died of heart and liver failure at just 39 inches her parents' modest home. Without funds for a proper funeral, she was quietly cremated, a heartbreaking end for a woman who'd once been Hollywood royalty. Her tragic trajectory from star to streetwalker remains one of Hollywood's most disturbing cautionary tales. But which comedy legend was destroyed by a scandal so severe, even an acquittal couldn't save him? Number 2. Roscoe. Fatty Arbuckle. Roscoe Fatty. Arbuckle's spectacular crash from Hollywood's highest-paid star to industry pariah represents the first great Hollywood scandal and possibly its most devastating fall. In the early 1920s, this comedic genius earned an unprecedented $1 million annual salary, equivalent to $14 million today, owned a collection of luxury cars, and had millions of adoring fans. 3 years later, he was broke, blacklisted, and broken. Everything collapsed during a wild Labor Day weekend party in 1921 at San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel. A young actress named Virginia Rappe became seriously ill during the festivities and died days later. Though the details remain disputed, newspapers exploded with sensationalized allegations that Arbuckle had assaulted Rappe with a bottle, crushing her with his 266-pound frame. William Randolph Hearst's newspaper empire turned the story into America's first media circus, printing fabricated details that whipped public opinion into a frenzy. Despite being acquitted after 3 grueling trials, with the final jury even issuing an unprecedented written apology, the damage was irreversible. The newly formed Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America banned him from films. Theaters refused to show his completed movies, and studios shelved projects worth millions. The legal battle alone cost him an estimated $700,000, a staggering sum that drained his fortune. Desperate to work again, Arbuckle directed films under the pseudonym William Goodrich. But his days of stardom were finished. His health deteriorated under the strain of public hatred and financial ruin. When he died of a heart attack in 1933, at just 46, he left behind little more than debts and broken dreams. The first actor to earn a $1 million contract died virtually penniless, his legacy buried under scandal rather than celebrated for his pioneering comedy. Up next, which trailblazing actress made Oscar history but died with just 24 cents in her bank account? Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge shattered Hollywood's racial ceiling when she became the first African-American woman nominated for a Best Actress Academy Award for Carmen Jones in 1954. Her mesmerizing beauty and extraordinary talent promised a groundbreaking career. But by the time she died in 1965 at just 42, This trailblazing star had exactly 24 cents in her bank account. How could someone so talented end up with less than a quarter to her name? Despite her historic Oscar nomination, Dandridge faced the crushing reality of 1950 Hollywood, a time when leading roles for black actresses were virtually non-existent. While white contemporaries like Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor enjoyed continuous work, Dandridge often waited years between suitable roles. When Porgy and Bess finally offered another starring opportunity, the film's commercial failure further limited her prospects. Behind the glamorous facade, Dandridge's finances were in free fall. Unscrupulous managers and advisors drained her earnings through bad investments and outright theft. Her marriage to restaurant owner Jack Dennison proved catastrophic when he squandered her remaining savings on failed business ventures before abandoning her. By 1963, she was forced to declare bankruptcy, owing approximately $150,000 in debt, a crushing sum at the time. Personal tragedy compounded her financial ruin. Her daughter, Carolyn, born with brain damage, required expensive institutional care that Dandridge struggled to afford. Increasingly desperate, she took to performing in second-rate nightclubs, sometimes for as little as $200 per week, a humiliating step down for a former Oscar nominee. On September 8, 1965, Dandridge was found dead in her modest West Hollywood apartment from an antidepressant overdose. The woman who once dazzled in designer gowns on Hollywood's biggest night died alone, broke and broken-hearted. A stark reminder of how the film industry failed one of its most brilliant stars. Which silent film beauty was discovered days after her death, with her starving dog still by her side. Number 10. Marie Prevost. Marie Prevost's death might be Hollywood's most macabre fall from grace. The silent film star who once captivated audiences with her comedic brilliance in films like The Marriage Circle was discovered in her rundown Los Angeles apartment in January 1937, her body partially mauled by her beloved dachshund who, starving after days with her corpse, had desperately nibbled at her legs. From Mack Sennett's bathing beauty to this horrific end, how did it come to this? During the roaring 1920, Prevost embodied the era's carefree spirit. Her vivacious charm and natural comedic timing made her one of silent cinema's most bankable stars. Directors like Ernst Lubitsch showcased her talents in sophisticated comedies that displayed both her beauty and considerable acting skills. Critics praised her magnetic presence and impeccable timing, with one reviewer calling her the most naturally gifted comedienne of her generation. The arrival of talkies in the late 1920s spelled disaster for many silent stars, but Prevost initially made the transition successfully. Her voice wasn't the issue Hollywood's brutal beauty standards were. As she entered her 30 seconds, she gained weight, prompting studios to relegate her to supporting roles. Depression led to alcoholism, creating a vicious cycle. Drinking caused more weight gain, which led to fewer roles and more drinking. By 1934, she was barely getting bit parts. Isolated and broke, with just $300 to her name, she retreated to a cheap apartment, where she drank herself to oblivion. The official cause of death was acute alcoholism and malnutrition. She had literally starved to death at 38. The woman who once earned $30,000 per film couldn't afford food. Prevost's tragic end inspired Kenneth Fearing's poem Dirge, with its haunting line about the little dog that licked her face to wake her up. From Hollywood royalty to a body discovered only after 2 homicides, neighbors complained about her dog's incessant barking. Few falls from grace have been so complete or disturbing. What legendary entertainer died owing the IRS $7 million, despite performing until his final days? Number 9. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr., the electrifying Mr. Show Business, who conquered every entertainment medium, died in 1990 with a staggering $7 million IRS debt, that his estate couldn't cover. Even after selling his assets, including homes, cars, and personal treasures, the gap remained a crushing $5.2 million. How does a member of the legendary Rat Pack, who performed alongside Sinatra and entertained presidents, die so deeply in the red? Davis earned astronomical sums throughout his 6-decade career. His performances commanded top dollar, whether in Las Vegas, on Broadway, or in films. His albums sold millions, his books became bestsellers, and his TV appearances drew massive audiences. At his peak, he was one of the highest-paid entertainers in America, reportedly earning over $45 million in his lifetime. Yet this remarkable success story concealed financial catastrophe. Davis lived extraordinarily large, maintaining multiple luxury homes, collecting expensive jewelry, and owning dozens of custom suits and cars. His generosity was legendary. He routinely picked up massive tabs and gave lavish gifts to friends and even casual acquaintances. This extravagance, combined with a gambling habit that saw him drop tens of thousands in single casino visits, formed a perfect storm of financial mismanagement. The IRS problems began in the 1970s and snowballed through penalties and interest. In his final years, while battling the throat cancer that would eventually kill him, Davis maintained a punishing performance schedule, working through pain and exhaustion to chip away at his impossible debt. When Davis died on May 16, 1990 at 64, he was still touring despite having lost weight, strength, and part of his jaw to cancer. The entertainer who had broken racial barriers and achieved unprecedented crossover success left behind little but debt. A heartbreaking finale for a performer who had given audiences everything he had, literally until his final breath. Which iconic screen siren with a distinctive hairstyle ended up working as a cocktail waitress? Number 8. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake, the blonde bombshell whose peekaboo hairstyle launched a million copycats, plummeted from Hollywood's A-list to working as a cocktail waitress in New York City. The star of noir classics like This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia, who commanded $4,500 weekly at her peak, died, broke, and forgotten. At 50. How does a signature look that once graced magazine covers worldwide end up serving drinks to customers who don't even recognize her? Lake exploded onto the scene in the early 1940s with her unique combination of smoldering sexuality and cool detachment. Her trademark partially obscured eye hairstyle became so popular that the government asked her to change it during World War II, because factory workers copying the look were getting their hair caught in machinery. Paired with Alan Ladd in a series of hit films, she embodied film noir's femme fatale and became one of Paramount's most valuable assets. Behind the scenes, Lake's reputation for being difficult spread quickly. Director René Clair called her a very hard woman, while others complained about chronic lateness and forgotten lines. What many didn't realize was that Lake suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and used alcohol to self-medicate. As her behavior worsened, roles dried up, and by 1950 she declared bankruptcy. Her spectacular downfall continued through the 1950 and 1960. She was briefly hospitalized for mental health issues and alcoholism. The glamour queen was reduced to working as a barmaid at the Martha Washington Hotel in New York, where a reporter found her in 1962. When asked about her fall from fame, Lake simply said, "I wasn't a has-been, I was a never was." By the time she died in 1973 from hepatitis and renal failure, Lake was living in the cheapest room of a Vermont hotel. The funeral home held her remains for days because no one would pay for her cremation. Hollywood's once shimmering peek-a-boo girl ended as unrecognizable ashes that nearly went unclaimed. Which comedy pioneer went from inventing modern film stunts to being reduced to TV cameos? Number 7. Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton, the great stone face, who revolutionized cinema with his death-defying stunts and ingenious visual gags, went from owning a $300,000 Beverly Hills mansion, about $4.5 million today, to living in a tiny apartment at the back of property he once owned. The silent film genius behind masterpieces like The General and Sherlock Jr. saw his fortune evaporate almost overnight. What drove this filmmaking pioneer from industry titan to industry footnote? Keaton's downfall began with what he later called the worst mistake of my career, signing with MGM in 1928. The studio system crushed his creative independence, forcing him to abandon his innovative filmmaking approach for formulaic comedies. His unique vision was replaced by committee decisions, and scripts were handed to him rather than growing from his brilliant visual imagination. Critics noticed immediately, with reviews lamenting the loss of the old Keaton magic. As his artistic control vanished, so did his personal life. A bitter 1932 divorce from Natalie Talmadge cost him most of his fortune and access to his children. The double blow of creative and personal loss drove Keaton into alcoholism, further accelerating his downward spiral. By 1934, he was fired from MGM and declared bankruptcy soon after. The 1940 found Keaton working as a gag writer at the same studios where he once ruled as king, anonymously creating comedy bits for other stars. MGM paid him just $100 weekly to craft gags for the Marx Brothers, a humiliating salary for a former industry giant. His alcoholism worsened until he was virtually unemployable. Though Keaton experienced a modest comeback in the 1950s with television appearances and film cameos, he never recaptured his former wealth or status. When he died of lung cancer in 1966, he was living modestly in a small suburban house, a far cry from his 1920 mansion. The man who literally invented many of cinema's greatest techniques died with just a fraction of the fortune his genius had created. Which horror icon was so broke at the end that Frank Sinatra secretly paid for his funeral? Number 6. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi, whose chilling portrayal of Count Dracula defined horror for generations, died so destitute that Frank Sinatra anonymously covered his funeral expenses. The Hungarian actor who famously declared, "I am Dracula," became a victim of the very role that made him famous, trapped in a coffin of typecasting that buried his career. How did the most recognizable vampire in cinema history end up with just $1,900 to his name? Lugosi's thick Hungarian accent, initially considered exotic and mysterious in early talkies, quickly limited his casting options after Dracula, 1931. While Boris Karloff diversified into various roles, Lugosi found himself repeatedly cast as sinister foreigners or monsters. Studios paid him a fraction of what other horror stars earned for The Raven. Universal paid Karloff $10,000, but gave Lugosi only $1,500, despite equal billing. Behind his aristocratic screen presence lurked a man in constant physical pain. Severe sciatica. From old, war injuries led doctors to prescribe morphine, eventually triggering a devastating addiction. Treatment attempts, including several hospitalizations, drained what little money he managed to earn. At one point, Lugosi publicly admitted himself to a rehabilitation facility because he couldn't afford private care. By the 1950s, the once commanding star was reduced to appearing in Ed Wood's notoriously awful films for just a few $100s per picture. Plan 9 from Outer Space, widely considered one of the worst films ever made, features Lugosi posthumously v. He died during filming and was replaced by Wood's chiropractor holding a cape over his face. In 1955, Lugosi filed for bankruptcy, listing assets of $1,900 against debts of $3,500. He died the following year, wearing one of his Dracula capes. He would be buried in it, as he couldn't afford a suit. The final, cruel irony. Decades after his death, Lugosi's Dracula image continued generating millions in merchandising revenue, none of which went to his estate. Do you know which legendary comedy partner had to make public appeals for financial help in his final years? Number 5. Bud Abbott. Bud Abbott, the straight man of the iconic Abbott and Costello comedy team, went from commanding $15,000 weekly at his peak to making televised pleas for financial assistance in his final years. The mastermind behind the legendary Who's on First routine, once playing command performances for the British royal family, died virtually penniless in 1974. How does half of Hollywood's most successful comedy duo end up broke and forgotten? At their height in the 1940s, Abbott and Costello were box office gold. Their films consistently ranked among the year's top-grossing releases, with Buck Privates earning Universal Pictures $4 million on a $180,000 budget. They commanded 20% of their film's profits, starred in a hit radio show, and later conquered television. Their combined earnings would translate to hundreds of millions in today's dollars. Their patriotic efforts during World War II, where they tirelessly performed for troops and sold millions in war bonds, ironically triggered their financial downfall. The IRS disallowed $500,000 in tax exemptions they had claimed for these bond-raising expenses, launching a tax nightmare that would haunt Abbott for the rest of his life. After Costello's death in 1959, Abbott attempted to continue performing solo, but audiences wanted the duo, not just the straight man. His health was deteriorating due to epilepsy, and the medication affected his ability to work consistently. Meanwhile, the IRS continued pursuing their tax claim, eventually seizing his home and most of his assets. In his final years, Abbott lived in a modest apartment. Having lost nearly everything, he was forced to auction memorabilia and personal belongings to cover basic expenses. The man whose precise timing and businesslike demeanor had set up some of comedy's greatest punchlines died on April 24, 1974, with barely enough money for his own funeral, a bitter finale for an entertainer who had once made millions laugh. Which child star voiced a Disney classic but ended up buried in an unmarked pauper's grave? Number 4. Bobby Driscoll. Bobby Driscoll, the original voice of Peter Pan and star of Disney's Treasure Island, went from Hollywood's golden boy to dying alone in an abandoned New York tenement at just 31, his body remaining unidentified for nearly 2 years. The first child actor to sign a long-term Disney contract ended up buried in an unmarked pauper's grave on Hart Island. How does a kid who won a Special Academy Award at 12 end up a forgotten junkie in a derelict building? Discovered at just 5 years old, Driscoll quickly became Walt Disney's favorite child actor. By his teens, he was earning $1,750 weekly, a phenomenal sum for the 1940s. His performance in The Window, 1949, earned him a special Juvenile Academy Award, and as the voice and live-action model for Peter Pan, he seemed destined for a lifelong career. Disney executives called him the embodiment of innocence, while Walt himself considered him the living embodiment of his most famous characters. But Hollywood's love affair with child stars has always been conditional. As puberty hit, bringing acne and changing features, the studio that had once celebrated him suddenly canceled his contract. At 16, he was unceremoniously dropped by Disney, with Walt reportedly refusing to see him. One minute I was their golden boy. The next, I was a has-been. Rejected and confused, Driscoll spiraled into drug addiction. Multiple arrests for drug possession and burglary followed, along with stints in jail and rehabilitation centers. His marriage collapsed, his money vanished, and by his 20s, he was living on the streets, unrecognizable from his Disney days. In March 1968, 2 children playing in a deserted East Village building discovered his body. With no identification, he was buried anonymously in New York's Potter's Field. His mother, who had been searching for him, didn't learn of his death until almost 2 years later when she hired a private detective. Disney's once-beloved Peter Pan had truly become the boy who wouldn't grow up, frozen in time at 31 inches, an unmarked grave. Which suave gangster actor turned down The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, then died broke? Number 3. George Raft. George Raft, the slick gangster actor who famously flipped a coin in Scarface, made arguably the worst career decisions in Hollywood history, turning down lead roles in The Maltese Falcon, High Sierra, and Casablanca, all of which went to Humphrey Bogart and made him a legend. These catastrophic choices, coupled with extravagant spending and mob connections, left Raft bankrupt in his final years. How does someone reject the most iconic roles in cinema and end up penniless? At his peak in the 1930 and early 42nds, Raft was Warner Brothers' go-to tough guy, commanding top salaries and living like the gangsters he portrayed. His reputation for authenticity came honestly raised in Hell's Kitchen. He had real-life friendships with notorious mobsters like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. These connections gave his performances an edge that critics praised as unnervingly realistic and chillingly authentic. Raft's spectacular fall began with those infamous role rejections. His explanation? He didn't want to die at the end of films, not realizing these death scenes would have given him cinematic immortality. As Bogart's star rose with the very roles Raft rejected, his own career stagnated with forgettable gangster flicks. Financial disaster followed. Raft's legendary generosity, he reportedly gave away millions to friends, family, and strangers in need, drained his accounts. His investments in nightclubs with mob connections backfired spectacularly, and his gambling habits at Las Vegas casinos further depleted his fortune. By the 1960 Raft was taking any work available, including an embarrassing cameo in Ocean's 11 and appearing as himself in The George Raft Story, a film about his rise and fall. He declared bankruptcy in 1966, listing debts of over $100,000. When he died of leukemia in 1980 at 79, he was living in a rented Los Angeles apartment with barely enough money for his funeral, a far cry from the man who once gave $50,000 tips to restaurant servers. Which beloved child star testified to Congress about elder abuse before dying with just $18,000? Number 2. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney, the pint-sized powerhouse who became the world's top box office draw as a teenager, died in 2014, with a measly $18,000 to his name, not even enough to cover his funeral expenses. The star of the Andy Hardy films and National Velvet, who earned the equivalent of $100 million during his 90-year career, spent his final years fighting elder abuse and financial exploitation. How does Hollywood's former Hashon star die unable to afford his own burial? Rooney's astounding career spanned nearly the entire history of cinema. He began as a child in silent films and remained active into the 21st century, appearing in over 300 films. At his peak in the late 1930s, he was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's biggest star, with fan clubs worldwide and earnings that made him one of Hollywood's wealthiest teenagers. Sir Laurence Olivier once called Rooney the greatest actor of them all. This unprecedented success was matched by equally spectacular financial failures. 8 marriages, including one to Ava Gardner, resulted in numerous alimony payments and legal fees. His addiction to gambling, particularly horse racing, saw millions vanish at tracks across America. Add alcoholism, prescription drug abuse, and a series of disastrous business ventures, and Rooney's fortune disappeared almost as quickly as he earned it. By 1962, he filed for bankruptcy with debts exceeding $500,000. Subsequent decades brought diminishing roles and continued financial struggles, The final blow came when family members, particularly his eighth wife's son, allegedly began siphoning off what little money he had left, isolating him from friends and other family. In 2011, at age 90, Rooney testified before Congress about elder abuse, detailing how he had been financially exploited and emotionally mistreated by relatives. When he died 3 years later, his estate couldn't cover funeral costs. Forest Lawn Cemetery fronted the expenses after learning of his situation, a heartbreaking end for a performer who had once commanded $150,000 per film. The boy who had saved MGM from bankruptcy couldn't afford to bury himself. Which British comedy icon with a trademark gap-toothed grin lost everything to Parkinson's disease? Number 1. Terry Thomas. Terry Thomas, the gap-toothed British comedian whose catchphrase, "You're an absolute shower," made him a global star, died in poverty after Parkinson's disease drained his fortune and destroyed his career. The debonair star of Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World spent his final years in a charity flat, unable to afford proper care. How does an actor who epitomized upper-class British charm end up dependent on fans' donations? At his peak in the 1950 and 60 seconds, Terry Thomas was cinema's quintessential English cad, with his distinctive gap between his front teeth, cigarette holder, and impeccably tailored suits. His roles as aristocratic bounders and eccentric gentlemen made him wealthy enough to own homes in London, Hollywood, and the French Riviera. His parties were legendary, attended by everyone from Laurence Olivier to Frank Sinatra. His world collapsed in 1970 when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at just 60. The condition progressed with cruel speed, robbing him of the precise comic timing and physical expressiveness that had made him a star. Roles quickly dried up as his symptoms worsened. By 1977, he could barely work, with his final film appearance showing him noticeably affected by tremors. The financial impact was devastating. Treatment costs soared to £75,000 annually, equivalent to over $100,000 at the time, while his income plummeted to nearly nothing. He was forced to sell his homes, cars, and eventually even personal items like his beloved collection of silk handkerchiefs and bespoke suits, the very symbols of the dandy persona he'd created. By 1989, Terry Thomas was living in a 3-room charity flat in London, his care funded by donations after fellow comedians organized a benefit called the Night of 100 Stars to raise money for him. He died on January 8, 1990, at 78, having spent his final years in the grip of a disease that had taken everything: his career, his fortune, and finally, his dignity. The man who had once personified sophisticated comedy ended his days unable to control his own movements or pay his own bills. What do you think about the way Hollywood treated these icons? Was the industry cruel to discard them? Or should stars be better prepared for life after fame? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and ask yourself, in today's celebrity-obsessed culture, have we really changed how we build up and tear down our entertainment idols?